In the US, Samsung is just that phone brand, or the logo on a nice TV. You think you know them, but you're picturing a company. You should be picturing a government. Imagine if Apple, Amazon, General Electric, and the nation's largest hospital network were all owned by one family. That's Samsung. It isn't a business, it's an entire ecosystem that citizens in South Korea are born into, work for, and eventually are buried by. We're talking about an entity that accounts for a massive chunk of an entire nation's GDP. To put that in perspective, if Walmart were that influential, it would be running the US government. But Samsung's true power goes beyond the boardroom. They own the souls of millions through a secret, dark connection to the country's most notorious cult. And that's just the start of it. Let's look at the real face of the empire. Samsung isn't a company. It's a republic. Founded in 1938 by Lee Byung-chul as a simple trading shop selling dried fish and noodles, it grew into a monster alongside the nation itself. The real secret to their size wasn't just hard work. It was a deliberate, state-sponsored marriage between the government and the family. After the Korean War, the country was in ruins, and the government needed to rebuild fast. They turned to a handful of trusted families, the chaebols, and gave them almost unlimited power. They received massive, low-interest loans, protected markets, and tax breaks that no normal business could ever dream of. In exchange, they were expected to turn South Korea into an industrial powerhouse. Samsung took that government money and bet on everything. They pivoted from textiles into shipping, heavy construction, and eventually the high-stakes gamble of semiconductors. They built the ships that moved the world's cargo and the infrastructure that modernized the nation. Every time a new industry opened up, Samsung was there, fueled by the government's checkbook. This allowed them to grow exponentially faster than any Western competitor. They weren't just a tech company, they became an extension of the state's industrial policy. They effectively operated like a state-owned enterprise, but with the profit-seeking greed of a private family business. This cradle-to-grave dominance wasn't an accident, it was the plan. The government ensured that Samsung could enter any market they wanted, while foreign competitors were kept out. By the time the world started buying their phones, the foundation was already set. Samsung was simply too big to compete with, too big to regulate, and ultimately, too big to fail. They became the nation's backbone by design, creating a feedback loop where they grew so large that they effectively became the government's primary creditor. In South Korea, taking over a family empire like Samsung isn't just a promotion, it's a modern-day coronation. By 2014, Lee Jae-yong was the prince. His father, Lee Kun-hee, was the absolute owner of Samsung and the richest man in the country, with a net worth of $13 billion. At that time, Samsung wasn't just a tech giant. It was responsible for 20% of South Korea's entire economy. If Samsung stumbled, the whole country fell. But in May 2014, the king fell. Lee Kun-hee suffered a massive heart attack and was left in a permanent coma. This created a massive problem for his son. In South Korea, the inheritance tax is a brutal 50%. If Jae-yong simply inherited his father's shares, he would owe the government $6 billion. To pay that bill, he would have to sell his Samsung stocks. But the moment he sold those stocks, he would lose his voting power. He would still be rich, but he wouldn't be the boss anymore. Outside investors could walk in and fire him from his own family company. Jae-yong needed a way to take control without paying the taxman. His plan was a merger between two Samsung companies, Samsung C&T and Cheil Industries. Jae-yong owned a lot of Cheil, but he owned almost nothing of C&T. However, C&T was the company that actually held the keys to the kingdom. It owned the shares of the real prize, Samsung Electronics. If he could merge the two, he could trade his Cheil shares for C&T shares. To make it a free trade for himself, he had to make his company, Cheil, look super expensive, and the other company, C&T, look worthless. The biggest shareholder of C&T was the National Pension Service, NPS. This is the retirement money of every hardworking grandmother, factory worker, and school teacher in Korea. Because the merger undervalued C&T, it was essentially a plan to steal value from the public's retirement fund to help a billionaire keep his throne. Logically, the pension service should have voted no to protect the people's money. But they didn't. They voted yes. Because the pension service is controlled by the government, and the government was being run by a ghost. For years, rumors swirled that President Park Geun-hye was being remote controlled by her childhood friend, Chae Soon-sil. Chae was the daughter of a cult leader who had befriended the president decades earlier, claiming he could talk to the president's dead mother. Most people dismiss this as a crazy conspiracy theory, until October 2016. Reporters had been digging into Chae's secret office in Seoul, which she had suddenly abandoned to flee to Germany. When they arrived, they found a stack of boxes left behind in the mess. Inside one of them was a Samsung tablet. This device was the smoking gun that proved the government wasn't run by the elected president. When the reporters turned it on, they found the internal secrets of the South Korean government. The tablet contained 44 presidential speeches. Some were saved on the device before the president had even delivered them. They had been edited by Chae, a private citizen with no government clearance. The device was packed with top-secret military documents and diplomatic plans that should have been locked in a government safe. It contained personal photos and selfies of Chae, proving she was the one who actually owned and used the device. The term "possessed" became the rallying cry of the public. It wasn't literal magic, it was a total loss of power. The president was effectively a puppet. When the news broke, it didn't just hurt the president, it directly implicated the business giants who had been paying Chae for favors. The tablet turned a political scandal into a national emergency, and it pointed directly at Samsung's front door. If you want to see what corruption looks like today, don't look for briefcases full of cash. Look for a horse named Vitana V. Samsung funneled nearly $18 million into a shell company in Germany to buy this world-class horse for the cult leader's daughter, Chung Yu-ra. The deal was simple. Jae-young would fund Choi's luxury life and her daughter's equestrian dreams. In exchange, Choi would tell the president to make sure the pension service voted yes on the merger. While the average Korean student was studying 16 hours a day just to land a basic job, the prince was buying gold-plated gear for a cultist. The anger in Seoul was reaching a boiling point. The pride of South Korea was taking orders from a woman who believed she had magic powers. The police raids began. They marched into Samsung's headquarters and seized hard drives, phone logs, and bank records. Jae-young was called to testify. He sat there, looking small and scared. He claimed he didn't know where the money went. He claimed the president forced him. But the prosecutors didn't see a victim. They saw a master manipulator who used a cult as a backdoor key to his empire. But as the evidence piled up, Jae-young realized the one thing his billions couldn't buy was silence. In any other country, stealing $8 billion from the public's pension and funding a cult would mean life in a concrete cell. But Lee Jae-young didn't just have money, he had the Samsung immunity. In August 2017, he was sentenced to 5 years. It felt like justice, but it was actually just an intermission. Behind the scenes, the Samsung legal machine went into overdrive, using a logic so twisted it made the public's blood boil. His lawyers argued that he didn't offer bribes. He was extorted by the president. They framed the most powerful man in the country as a helpless victim who had no choice but to hand over millions for a racing horse. And the court actually bought it. In less than a year, an appeals judge did something unthinkable. He slashed the sentence and let Jae-young walk free on a suspended sentence. While the people who lost their retirement money were struggling to buy groceries, the prince was back in his private jet, flying to international meetings as if nothing had happened. But the real insult came later. In 2021, he was sent back to jail for a brief moment, only to be granted a special presidential pardon. The government's excuse? They said the country needed his leadership to secure computer chips and vaccines. They used a national crisis as a get-out-of-jail-free card for a man who had treated the nation's treasury like his personal ATM. Jae-young didn't just get off easy, he made the law look like a joke, proving that in Korea, if you're too big to jail, the rules simply don't apply to you. He walked out of prison to a crowd of flashing cameras, not with an apology, but with a plan to take back everything he nearly lost. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about pride. Samsung is Korea's hero. When Jae-young was arrested, it was like catching your hero stealing from your own family. His lawyers tried to say he was a victim of the Samsung tax, pay the president or the company dies. But the evidence showed Jae-young was an active architect of the plan. He met with the president in secret meetings that weren't on any official schedule. It was a cold, dirty trade, the retirement money of the people in exchange for the crown of the empire. When the shaman, Choi Soon-sil, was finally sentenced to 20 years, she screamed that she was being framed. But the damage was done. The secret queen was behind bars. The Samsung heir learned that money can buy a company, but it can never buy back the trust of a nation. And yet, despite the protests and the prison time, Lee Jae-young didn't just survive, he won. But as he looks out from his office at the top of the Samsung Tower, he knows one thing: the tablet is still out there,